Welcome back to the Darkest Page podcast. Tonight we continue Joseph Sheridan Fenu's story of The Familiar. If you have not listened to the first part, I encourage you to go back and listen to part 1. Chapter 5. Mr. Barton states his case. "My dear sir," said Doctor, after a brief pause, "I fear you have been very unhappy indeed, but I venture to predict that the depression under which you labour will be found to originate in purely physical causes, and that with a change of air and the aid of a few tonics your spirits will return, and the tone of your mind be once more cheerful and tranquil as heretofore." There was, after all, more truth than we are willing to admit in the classic theories which assign the undue predominance of any one affliction of the mind to the undue action of tropody, or of one or other of our bodily organs. Believe me that a little attention to diet, exercise, and the other essentials of health under competent direction will make you as much yourself as you can wish. "Doctor," said Barton with something like a shudder, "I cannot delude myself with such a hope. I have no hope to cling to but one, and that is, by some other spiritual agency more potent than that which tortures me, it may be combated, and I delivered. If this may not be, I am lost, now and forever lost." "But Mr. Barton, you must remember," urged his companion, "that others have suffered as you have done, and—" No, interrupted he with irritability. "No, sir, I am not a credulous, far from a superstitious man. I have been, perhaps too much the reverse, too sceptical, too slow of belief, but unless I were one whom no amount of evidence could convince, unless I were to contemn the repeated, the perpetual evidence of my own senses, I am now at last constrained to believe. I have no escape from the conviction, the overwhelming certainty that I am haunted and dogged, go where I may, by a demon." There was a preternatural energy of horror in Barton's face, as, with its damp and death-like lineaments turned towards his companion, he thus delivered himself. "God help you, my poor friend," said Doctor, much shocked. "God help you, for indeed you are a sufferer, however your sufferings may have been caused." Aye, God help me," echoed Burton sternly. "But will he help me? Will he help me?" "Pray to him. Pray in a humble and trusting spirit," said he. Pray, echoed he again. "I can't pray. I could as easily move a mountain by an effort of my will. I have not belief enough to pray. There is something within me that will not pray. You prescribe impossibilities, literal impossibilities." "You will not find it so, if you will but try," said Doctor. "Try! I have tried, and the attempt only fills me with confusion and sometimes terror. I have tried in vain, and more than in vain. The awful, unutterable idea of eternity and infinity oppresses and maddens my brain whenever my mind approaches the contemplation of the Creator. I recoil from the effort scared. I tell you, Doctor, if I am to be saved, it must be by other means. The idea of eternal Creator is to me intolerable. My mind cannot support it." "Say then, my dear sir," urged he, "say how you would have me serve you. What would you learn of me? What I can do or say to relieve you?" "Listen to me first," replied Captain Barton, with a subdued air and an effort to suppress his excitement. "Listen to me, while I detail the circumstances of the persecution under which my life has become all but intolerable, a persecution which has made me fear death and the world beyond the grave as much as I have grown to hate existence." Barton then proceeded to relate the circumstances which I have already detailed, and then continued. "This has now become habitual, an accustomed thing. I do not mean the actual seeing him in the flesh, thank God. That at least is not permitted daily. Thank God, from the ineffable horrors of that visitation I have been mercifully allowed intervals of repose, though none of security, but from the consciousness that a malign spirit is following and watching me wherever I go, I have never for a single instant a temporary respite. I am pursued with blasphemies, cries of despair and appalling hatred. I hear those dreadful sounds called after me as I turn the corners of the streets. They come in the night time, while I sit in my chamber alone. They haunt me everywhere, charging me with hideous crimes, and great God, threatening me with coming vengeance and eternal misery. Hush! Do you hear that? He cried with a horrible smile of triumph. There! Will that convince you? The clergyman felt a chill of horror steal over him, while during the wail of a sudden gust of wind he heard, or fancied he heard, the half-articulate sounds of rage and derision mingled in the sough. Well, what do you think of that? At length Barton cried, drawing a long breath through his teeth. I heard the wind, said Doctor. What should I think of it? What is there remarkable about it? The prince of the powers of the air, muttered Barton with a shudder. Tut, my dear sir, said the student with an effort to reassure himself, for although it was broad daylight, there was nevertheless something disagreeably contagious in the nervous excitement under which his visitor so miserably suffered. You must not give way to these wild fancies. You must resist these impulses of the imagination. I resist the devil, and he will flee from thee, said Barton in the same tone. But how resist him? There it is. There is the rub. What am I to do? What can I do? My dear sir, this is fancy, said the man of folio. You are your own tormentor. No, sir, fancy has no part in it, answered Barton somewhat sternly. Fancy? Was it that made you, as well as me? Here, but this moment. Those accents of hell. Fancy indeed. No. But you have seen this person frequently, said the ecclesiastic. Why have you not accosted or secured him? Is it not a little preceptive to say no more, to assume, as you have done, the existence of preternatal agency, when, after all, everything may be easily accountable if only proper means were taken to sift the matter? There are circumstances connected with this appearance, said Barton, which it is needless to disclose, but which to me are proofs of its horrible nature. I know that the being that follows me is not human. I say I know this. I can prove it to your own conviction. He paused for a minute, and then added, And as to the accosting it, I dare not. I could not. When I see it, I am powerless. I stand in the gaze of death, in the triumphant presence of infernal power and malignity. My strength, my faculties, and memory all forsake me. Oh God, I fear, sir, you know not what you speak of. Mercy, heaven have pity on me. He leaned his elbow on the table and passed his hand across his eyes, as if to exclude some image of horror, muttering the last words of the sentence he had just concluded again and again. Doctor, he said abruptly, raising himself and looking full upon the clergyman with an imploring eye, I know you will do for me whatever may be done. You know now fully the circumstances and the nature of my affliction. I tell you I cannot help myself. I cannot hope to escape. I am utterly passive. I conjure you, then, to weigh my case well, and if anything may be done for me by vicarious supplication, by the intercession of the good, or by any aid or influence whatsoever, I implore of you, I adjure you in the name of the Most High, give me the benefit of that influence, deliver me from the body of this death, strive for me, pity me, I know you will. You cannot refuse this. It is the purpose and object of my visit. Send me away with some hope, however little, some faint hope of ultimate deliverance, and I will nerve myself to endure, from hour to hour, the hideous dream into which my existence has become transformed. Doctor assured him that all he could do was to pray earnestly for him, and that so much he would not fail to do. They parted with a hurried and melancholy valediction. Barton hastened to the carriage that awaited him at the door, drew down the blinds and drove away, while Doctor returned to his chamber to ruminate at leisure upon the strange interview which had just interrupted his studies. Chapter 6. Seen Again. It was not to be expected that Captain Barton's changed and eccentric habits should long escape remark and discussion. Various were the theories suggested to account for it. Some attributed the alteration to the pressure of secret pecuniary embarrassments, others to a repugnance to fulfill an engagement into which he was presumed to have precipitately entered, and others again to the supposed incipiency of mental disease, which later indeed was the most plausible, as well as the most generally received, of the hypotheses circulated in the gossip of the day. From the very commencement of this change, at first so gradual in its advances, Miss Montague had of course been aware of it. The intimacy involved in their peculiar relation, as well as the near interest which it inspired, afforded in her case a like opportunity and motive for the successful exercise of that keen and penetrating observation peculiar to her sex. His visits became, at length, so interrupted, and his manner, while they lasted, so abstracted, strange, and agitated, that Lady L, after hinting her anxiety and her suspicion more than once, at length distinctly stated her anxiety and pressed for an explanation. The explanation was given, and although its nature at first relieved the worst solicitudes of the old lady and her niece, yet the circumstances which attended it, and the really dreadful consequences which it obviously indicated as regarded the spirits, and indeed the reason of the now wretched man who made the strange declaration, were enough, upon little reflection, to fill their minds with perturbation and alarm. General Montague, the young lady's father, at length arrived. He had himself slightly known Barton some 10 or 12 years previous, and, being aware of his fortune and connections, was disposed to regard him as an unexceptional and indeed a most desirable match for his daughter. He laughed at the story of Barton's supernatural visitations, and lost no time in calling upon his intended son-in-law. "My dear Barton," he continued gaily after a little conversation, "my sister tells me you are a victim to blue devils in quite a new and original shape." Barton changed countenance and sighed profoundly. Come, I protest, this will never do," continued the General. "You are more like a man on his way to the gallows than to the altar. These devils have made quite a saint of you." Barton made an effort to change the conversation. No, it won't do," said his visitor, laughing. "I am resolved to say what I have to say upon this magnificent mock mystery of yours. You must not be angry, but really, is it too bad to see you are at your time of life absolutely frightened into good behaviour, like a naughty child by a bugaboo, and as far as I can learn, a very contemptible one? Seriously, I have been a good deal annoyed at what they tell me, but at the same time thoroughly convinced that there is nothing in the matter that may not be cleared up with a little attention and management within a week at the furthest." "Ah, General, you do not know," he began.
"Yes, but I do know quite enough to warrant my confidence," interrupted the soldier. "Don't I know that all your annoyance proceeds from the occasional appearance of a certain little man in a cap and a greatcoat, with a red vest and a bad face, who follows you about and pops upon you at corners of lanes and throws you into ague fits? Now, my dear fellow, I'll make it my business to catch this mischievous little mountebank, and either beat him to a jelly with my own hands, or have him whipped through the town at the cart's tail before a month passes."
"If you knew what I knew," said Barton with gloomy agitation, "you would speak very differently. Don't imagine that I am so weak as to assume, without proof, the most overwhelming, the conclusion to which I have been forced. The proofs are here, locked up here." As he spoke he tapped upon his breast, and with an anxious sigh continued to walk up and down the room.
Well, Barton," said his visitor, "and I'll wager a rump and a dozen I call the ghost and convince even you before many days are over."
He was running on in the same strain when he was suddenly arrested, and not a little shocked by observing Barton, who had approached the window, stagger slowly backwards, like one who had received a stunning blow, his arms extended towards the street, his face and his very lips white as ashes, while he muttered, "There, by heaven! There! General Montague started mechanically to his feet, and from the window of the drawing-room saw a figure corresponding, as well as his hurry would permit him to discern, with the description of the person whose appearance so persistently disturbed the repose of his friend. The figure was just turning from the rails of the area upon which it had been leaning, and, without waiting to see more, the old gentleman snatched his cane and hat and rushed down the stairs and into the street, in the furious hope of securing the person and punishing the audacity of the mysterious stranger. He looked around him, but in vain, for any trace of the person he had himself distinctly seen. He ran breathlessly to the nearest corner, expecting to see from hence the retiring figure, but no such form was visible. Back and forward, from crossing to crossing, he ran at fault, and it was not until the curious gaze and laughing countenances of the passers-by reminded him of the absurdity of his pursuit that he checked his hurried pace, lowered his walking cane from the menacing attitude which he had mechanically given it, adjusted his hat, and walked composedly back again, inwardly vexed and flurried. He found Barton pale and trembling in every joint. They both remained silent, though under emotions very different. At last Barton whispered, "You saw it?"
"It? Him? Someone, you mean? To be sure I did," replied Montague testily. "But where is the good or the harm of seeing him? The fellow runs like a lamplighter. I wanted to catch him, but he had stolen away before I could reach the hall door. However, it is no great matter. Next time I dare say I'll do better, and egged if I once come within reach of him, I'll introduce his shoulder to the weight of me cane."
Notwithstanding General Montague's undertakings and extortions, however, Barton continued to suffer from the self-same unexplained cause. Go how, when, or where he would, he was still constantly dogged or confronted by the being who had established over him so horrible an influence. Nowhere and at no time was he secure against the odious appearance which haunted him with such diabolic perseverance. His depression, misery, and excitement became more settled and alarming every day, and the mental agonies that ceaselessly preyed upon him began at last so sensibly to affect his health that Lady L. and General Montague succeeded, without indeed much difficulty, in persuading him to try a short tour on the continent, in the hope that the entire change of scene would, at all events, have the effect of breaking through the influences of local association, which the more sceptical of his friends assumed to be by no means inoperative in suggesting and perpetuating what they conceived to be a mere form of nervous illusion. General Montague, indeed, was persuaded that the figure which haunted his intended son-in-law was by no means the creation of his imagination, but on the contrary a substantial form of flesh and blood, animated by a resolution, perhaps with some murderous object in perspective, to watch and follow the unfortunate gentleman. Even this hypothesis was not a very pleasant one, yet it was plain that if Barton could ever be convinced that there was nothing preternatural in the phenomena which he had hitherto regarded in that light, the affair would lose all its terrors in his eyes, and wholly cease to exercise upon his health and spirits the baleful influence which it had hitherto done. He therefore reasoned that if the annoyance was actually escaped by mere locomotion and change of scene, it obviously could not have originated in any supernatural agency. Chapter 7. Flight. Yielding to their persuasions, Barton left Dublin for England, accompanied by General Montague. They posted rapidly to London, and thence to Dover, whence they took the packet with a fair wind for Calais. The General's confidence in the result of the expedition on Barton's spirits had risen day by day since their departure from the shores of Ireland, for to the inexpressible relief and delight of the latter, he had not since then so much as even once fancied a repetition of those impressions which had, when at home, drawn him gradually down to the very depths of despair. This exemption from what he had begun to regard as the inevitable condition of his existence, and the sense of security which began to pervade his mind, were inexpressibly delightful, and in the exultation of what he considered his deliverance, he indulged in 1,000 happy anticipations for a future into which so lately he had hardly dared to look, and in short, both he and his companion secretly congratulated themselves upon the termination of that persecution which had been to its immediate victim a source of such unspeakable agony. It was a beautiful day, and a crowd of idlers stood upon the jetty to receive the packet and enjoy the bustle of the new arrivals. Montague walked a few paces in advance of his friend, and as he made his way through the crowd, a little man touched his arm and said to him, in a broad provincial patois, "Monsieur is walking too fast. He will lose his sick comrade in the throng, for by my faith the poor gentleman seems to be fainting." Montague turned quickly and observed that Barton did indeed look deadly pale. He hastened to his side.
"My dear fellow, are you ill?"
he asked anxiously. The question was unheeded and twice repeated ere Barton stammered, I saw him I saw him.
Him? The wretch? Who? Where now? Where is he? Cried Montague, looking around.
I saw him, but he is gone, repeated Barton faintly.
But where? Where, for God's sake, speak! Urged Montague vehemently.
It is but this moment. Here, said he.
But what did he look like? What had he on? What did he wear? Quick, quick!
Urged his excited companion, ready to dart among the crowd and collar the delinquent on the spot. He touched your arm. He spoke to you. He pointed to me. God be merciful to me, there is no escape, said Barton in the low, subdued tones of despair. Montague had already bustled away in a flurry of mingled hope and rage, but though the singular personnel of the stranger who had accosted him was vividly impressed upon his recollection, he failed to discover among the crowd even the slightest resemblance to him. After a fruitless search in which he enlisted the services of several of the bystanders, who aided all the more zealously as they believed he had been robbed, he at length, out of breath and baffled, gave over the attempt. Ah, my friend, it won't do, said Barton with the faint voice and bewildered, ghastly look of one who had been stunned by some mortal shock. There is no use in contending. Whatever it is, the dreadful association between me and it is now established. I shall never escape. Never.
Nonsense, nonsense, my dear Barton, don't talk so, said Montague with something at once of irritation and dismay. You must not, I say. We'll jockey a scoundrel yet, never mind. I say never mind.
It was, however, but labour lost to endeavour henceforward to inspire Barton with one ray of hope. He became desponding. The intangible and, as it seemed, utterly inadequate influence was fast destroying his energies of intellect, character, and health. His first object was now to return to Ireland, there, as he believed, and now almost hoped, speedily to die. To Ireland accordingly he came, and one of the first faces he saw upon the shore was again that of his implacable and dreaded attendant. Barton seemed at last to have lost not only all enjoyment and every hope in existence, but all independence of will besides. He now submitted himself passively to the management of the friends most nearly interested in his welfare. With the apathy of entire despair he implicitly assented to whatever measures they suggested and advised, and as a last resource it was determined to remove him to a house of Lady L's in the neighbourhood of Clontarf, where, with the advice of his medical attendant, who persisted in the opinion that the whole train of consequences resulted merely from some nervous derangement, it was resolved that he was to confine himself strictly to the house, and make use only of those apartments which commanded a view of an enclosed yard, the gates of which were to be kept jealously locked. Those precautions would certainly secure him against the casual appearance of any living form that his excited imagination might possibly confound with the spectre, which, as it was contended, his fancy recognised in every figure that bore even a distant or general resemblance to the peculiarities with which his fancy had at first invested it. A month or 6 weeks' absolute seclusion under these conditions, it was hoped, might, by interrupting the series of these terrible impressions, gradually dispel the predisposing apprehensions and the associations which had confirmed the supposed disease and rendered recovery hopeless. Cheerful society and that of his friends was to be constantly supplied, and on the whole very sanguine expectations were indulged in, that under the treatment thus detailed the obstinate hypochondria of the patient might at length give way. Accompanied therefore by Lady L, General Montague, and his daughter, his own affianced bride, poor Barton himself never daring to cherish a hope of his ultimate emancipation from the horrors under which his life was literally wasting away, took possession of the apartments, whose situation protected him against the intrusions from which he shrank with such unutterable terror. After a little time, a steady persistence in this system began to manifest its results in a very marked, though gradual improvement, alike in the health and spirits of the invalid. Not indeed that anything at all approaching complete recovery was yet discernible. On the contrary, to those who had not seen him since the commencement of his strange sufferings, such an alteration would have been apparent as might well have shocked them. The improvement, however, such as it was welcomed with gratitude and delight, especially by the young lady, whom her attachment to him, as well as her now singularly painful position, consequent on his protracted illness, rendered an object scarcely 1 degree less to be commiserated than himself. A week passed, a fortnight, a month, and yet there had been no recurrence of that hated visitation. The treatment had, so far forth, been followed by complete success. The chain of associations was broken. The constant pressure upon the overtasked spirit had been removed, and under these comparatively favourable circumstances, the sense of social community with the world about him and something of human interest, if not of enjoyment, began to reanimate him. It was about this time that Lady L, who, like most old ladies of the day, was deep in family receipts and a great pretender to medical science, dispatched her own maid to the kitchen garden with a list of herbs, which were there to be carefully culled and brought back to the housekeeper for the purpose stated. The handmaiden, however, returned with her task scarce half completed, and a good deal flurried and alarmed. Her mode of accounting for her precipitated retreat and evident agitation was odd, and to the old lady, startling. Chapter 8. Softened. It appeared that she had repaired to the kitchen garden, pursuant to her mistress's directions, and had there begun to make the specified election among the rank neglected herbs which crowded one corner of the enclosure, and while engaged in this pleasant labour she carelessly sang a fragment of an old song, as she said, to keep herself company. She was, however, interrupted by an ill-natured laugh, and looking up she saw through the old thorn hedge which surrounded the garden a singularly ill-looking little man, whose countenance wore the stamp of menace and malignity, standing close to her at the other side of the hawthorn screen. She described herself as utterly unable to move or speak, while he charged her with a message for Captain Barton, the substance of which she distinctly remembered to have been to the effect that he, Captain Barton, must come abroad as usual and show himself to his friends out of doors, or else prepare for a visit in his own chamber. On concluding this brief message, the stranger had, with a threatening air, got down into the outer ditch, and seizing the hawthorn stems in his hand, seemed to the point of climbing through the fence, a feat which might have been accomplished without much difficulty. Without, of course, awaiting the results, the girl, throwing down her treasures of thyme and rosemary, had turned and run, with the swiftness of terror, to the house. Lady L commanded her, on pain of instant dismissal, to observe an absolute silence respecting all that passed of the incident which related to Captain Barton, and at the same time directed instant search to be made by her men in the garden and the fields adjacent. This measure, however, was as usual unsuccessful, and filled with indefinable misgivings. Lady L communicated the incident to her brother. The story, however, until long afterwards went no further, and of course it was jealously guarded from Barton, who continued to amend, though slowly. Barton now began to walk occasionally in the courtyard which I have mentioned, and which, being enclosed by a high wall, commanded no view beyond its own extent. Here he therefore considered himself perfectly secure, and, but for a careless violation of orders by one of the grooms, he might have enjoyed at least for some time longer his much prized immunity. Opening upon the public road, this yard was entered by a wooden gate with a wicket in it, and was further defended by an iron gate upon the outside. Strict orders had been given to keep both carefully locked, but spite of these, it had happened that one day, as Barton was slowly pacing this narrow enclosure in his accustomed walk, and reaching the farther extremity was turning to retrace his steps, he saw the boarded wicket ajar, and the face of his tormentor immovably looking at him through the iron bars. For a few seconds he stood riveted to the earth, breathless and bloodless, in the fascination of that dreaded gaze, and then fell helplessly insensible upon the pavement. There he was found a few minutes afterwards and conveyed to his room, the apartment which he was never afterwards to leave alive. Henceforward a marked and unaccountable change was observed in the tone of his mind. Captain Barton was now no longer the excited and despairing man he had been before. A strange alteration had passed upon him. An unearthly tranquillity reigned in his mind. It was the anticipated stillness of the grave. "Montague, my friend, this struggle is nearly ended now," he said tranquilly, but with a look of fixed and fearful awe. "I have at last some comfort from that world of spirits from which my punishment has come. I now know that my sufferings will soon be over." Montague pressed him to speak on. "Yes," he said in a softened voice, "my punishment is nearly ended. From sorrow perhaps I shall never in time or eternity escape, but my agony is almost over. Comfort has been revealed to me, and what remains of my allotted struggle I will bear with submission, even with hope."
"I'm glad to hear you speak so tranquilly, my dear Barton," said Montague. "Peace and cheer of mind are all you need to make you what you were."
"No, No, I never can be that, he said mournfully. I am no longer fit for life. I am soon to die. I am to see him but once again, and then all is ended.
He said so then,
suggested Montague. He? No, good tidings could scarcely come through him, and these were good and welcome, and they came so solemnly and sweetly, with unutterable love and melancholy, such as I could not, without saying more than is needed or fitting of other long past scenes and persons, fully explain to you. As Barton said this, he shed tears.
Come,
said Montague, mistaking the source of his emotions.
You must not give way. What is it, after all, but a pack of dreams and nonsense? Or at worst, the practices of a scheming rascal that enjoys his power of playing upon your nerves, and loves to exert it, a sneaking vagabond that owes you a grudge and pays it off this way, not daring to try a more manly one.
A grudge, indeed. He owes me, you say rightly, said Barton with a sudden shudder. A grudge, as you call it. Oh my God, when the justice of heaven permits the evil one to carry out a scheme of vengeance, when its execution is committed to the lost and terrible victims of sin, who owes his own ruin to the very man whom he is commissioned to pursue, then indeed the torments and terrors of hell are anticipated on earth. But heaven has dealt mercifully with me. Hope has opened to me at last, and if death could come without the dreadful sight I am doomed to see, I would gladly close my eyes this moment upon the world. But though death is welcome, I shrink with an agony you cannot understand, an actual frenzy of terror from the last encounter with that demon who has drawn me thus to the verge of the chasm, and who is himself to plunge me down. I am to see him again, once more, but under circumstances unutterably more terrific than ever. As Barton thus spoke, he trembled so violently that Montague was really alarmed at the extremity of his sudden agitation, and hastened to lead him back to the topic which had before seemed to exert so tranquilizing an effect upon his mind. It was not a dream, he said after a time. I was in a different state. I felt differently and strangely, and yet it was all real, as clear and vivid as what I now see and hear. It was a reality.
And what did you see and hear?
Urged his companion. When I wakened from the swoon I fell into on seeing him, said Barton, continuing as if he had not heard the question. It was slowly, very slowly. I was lying by the margin of a broad lake, with misty hills all round, and a soft, melancholy, rose-coloured light illuminated it all. It was unusually sad and lonely, and yet more beautiful than any earthly scene. My head was leaning on the lap of a girl. She was singing a song that told, I know not how, whether by words or harmonies, of all my life, all that is past, and all that is still to come. And with the song the old feelings that I thought had perished within me came back, and tears flowed from my eyes, partly for the song and its mysterious beauty, and partly for the unearthly sweetness of her voice. And yet I knew the voice, oh how well, and I was spellbound as I listened and looked at the solitary scene, without stirring, almost without breathing, and alas, without turning my eyes towards the face I knew was near me. So sweetly powerful was the enchantment that held me. And so, slowly, the song and scene grew fainter and fainter to my senses, till all was dark and still again. And then I woke to this world as you saw, comforted, for I knew that I was forgiven much. Barton wept again long and bitterly. From this time, as we have said, the prevailing tone of his mind was one of profound and tranquil melancholy. This, however, was not without its interruptions. He was thoroughly impressed with the conviction that he was to experience another and a final visitation, transcending in horror all he had before experienced. From this anticipated and unknown agony he often shrank in such paroxysms of abject terror and distraction as filled the whole household with dismay and superstitious panic. Even those among them who affected to discredit the theory of preternatural agency were often in their secret souls visited during the silence of night with qualms and apprehensions which they would not have readily confessed, and none of them attempted to dissuade Barton from the resolution on which he now systematically acted, of shutting himself up in his own apartment. The window blinds of this room were kept jealously down, and his own man was seldom out of his presence day or night, his bed being placed in the same chamber. This man was an attached and respectable servant, and his duties, in addition to those ordinarily imposed upon valets, but which Barton's independent habits generally dispensed with, were to attend carefully to the simple precautions by means of which his master hoped to exclude the dreaded intrusion of the watcher, and, in addition to attending to whose arrangements, which amounted merely to guarding against the possibility of his master's being, through any unscreened window or open door, exposed to the dreaded influence, the valet was never to suffer him to be alone. Total solitude, even for a minute, had become to him now almost as intolerable as the idea of going abroad into the public ways. It was an instinctive anticipation of what was coming. Chapter 9. Requiescat. It is needless to say that under these circumstances no steps were taken towards the fulfilment of that engagement into which he had entered. There was quite a disparity enough in point of years, and indeed of habits, between the young lady and Captain Barton to have precluded anything like very vehement or romantic attachment on her part. Though grieved and anxious, therefore, she was very far from being heartbroken. Miss Montague, however, devoted much of her time to the patient but fruitless attempt to cheer the unhappy invalid. She read to him and conversed with him, but it was apparent that whatever exertions he made, the endeavour to escape from the one ever-walking fear that preyed upon him was utterly and miserably unavailing. Young ladies are much given to the cultivation of pets, and among those who shared the favour of Miss Montague was a fine old owl, which the gardener, who caught him napping among the ivy of a ruined stable, had dutifully presented to that young lady. The caprice which regulates such preferences was manifested in the extravagant favour with which this grim and ill-favoured bird was at once distinguished by his mistress, and trifling as this whimsical circumstance